Hello, everybody. The objective of this seminar is to introduce the receptive skills procedure. And the idea is that everybody should watch this before next class so that we can apply flipped classroom, flipped teaching methodology in the next couple of classes. Right, so you start from the course website, and I would like you to open or download the document entitled Receptive Skills Procedure. That's what we're going to do right now. And basically, what I'm going to do now is in a very broad way, go over some of the information here. Now, what do we want with this procedure? As we saw in class last week, we want to develop the receptive sub-skills, those specialized listening or reading sub-skills that are really gonna help us to make sure that our students are becoming better listeners or better readers in English. From now on, I'll use most of my examples from listening. As we saw in class the other day, receptive skills procedure follows a three-part structure. We have a pre-section, we have a while section, and we have a post section. Here, pre, while, and post refer to whether it's before listening, during the listening, or actually after the listening. Now, what are the objectives of each of these stages? The pre-listening or pre-reading section, the main objective is, on the one hand, to introduce the context. On the other hand, really important to activate students' previous knowledge, what we have called schemata, knowledge of content experience, knowledge of genre, which is more important in the case of reading. And finally, it is also the occasion to pre-teach. In other words, to present or review some lexes in order to eliminate obstacles to doing the tasks. The second section is actually the most important. The while listening, while reading is where we make sure that we're helping students to become better listeners or better readers. We basically do the while reading through questions or tasks. Now, the questions and tasks are going to depend on a number of things: student ages and levels. So, primary, lower primary will set different tasks that will set in upper primary, secondary, adults. They're also going to depend essentially on the skills we want to develop. Now, one thing very important is that normally what we do is we set an easier task first, and then we set more difficult tasks. And this is what we called extensive. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. Extensive versus intensive tasks. Typically, not necessarily, but usually in the extensive task, we develop top-down skills, obviously in connection with the pre-reading or the pre-listening. So it is very common to ask students to make predictions in the pre, and then ask the students to check their predictions in the while through an extensive task. Now, turning to the intensive task, here usually we're developing more specialized sub-skills, such as listening for specific information, listening for detail, maybe inferring meaning from context, word identification through gap fills, and so on. Usually, intensive is a little bit harder, a little bit more looking for specific info than extensive. Very important in both cases, after each time there's a listening and associated tasks, there should be feedback. How can you conduct feedback? You can do it more teacher-centered, you can do it more student-centered, having students compare in pairs, maybe playing the recording again, helping students identify the information. There's a number of ways we'll be looking at. The last part of the while, which you, depending on the author or the specialist, can also be included in the post, is what we call the language focus. I would say language focus is a little bit more relevant in the case of reading, because there we have the text we can always go back to, but you may also do it in the listening. Now, the idea with the language focus is to provide a mini language development class or review. So say that there's an interesting lexical set in the text, and you want to go through it. Let's say, connecting words in the case of reading texts. Let's say there's a tense that is repeated all the time, and you want to review that tense. You could do this in the language focus. Crucially, as I mentioned here, the language focus is not the main objective of the class. It could be a secondary objective. So you should not be devoting most of the class to this objective. Finally, we finish the sequence with a post-listening, post-reading task or sequence of tasks. And usually the objective of this is skills work, skills integration. And given that it's the end of the class, and given that students have already been provided with a rich context, the situation, it makes a lot of sense to do productive skills. In a different way of putting it is that all the previous activity work as a scaffold to support students producing. What can we do? Very often we do speaking activities, discussion, role play, simulations, any type of fluency activity in pairs or small groups. But we may also do writing activities, letters, stories, posters, descriptions, essays. Some of these could also go as homework. With the older the learners are, the more it's possible to set homework tasks. A couple of remarks before finishing. This rationale has been thought for adult or adolescent learners, often in language school scenarios. Now, in the case of primary school learners, we might want to develop this in more than one session. Okay, so not your typical 1.5 hour class in a language school, but more like 2, even 3 classes. So you may, for example, do lead in, set the context, vocabulary work in class 1, listening and tasks, reading and tasks in class 2, maybe language focus, and have a full class for productive skills work. So it's definitely a flexible procedure, but it's one that makes a lot of sense, maximizes the integration of skills, and it's definitely a good strategy to help our students become better listeners or better readers. Thank you very much. I'll see you in class.